Mrs. Eleanor Ward sat in her worn armchair by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The late afternoon sun poured through the dusty curtains, casting soft golden light over the little apartment she had called home for over 30 years. The place was quiet, filled with old furniture, fading pictures, and memories that no longer spoke to anyone but her. At 87, Eleanor moved slowly but still with grace. Her silver hair was always brushed neatly, and she wore the same soft blue sweater she'd knitted decades ago. The apartment was small and a little cluttered, papers stacked on the coffee table, a teacup left from the morning, but it was hers. Every corner held a piece of her story. Her son James Ward hadn't visited in nearly 2 months. He was always busy. A big man in the business world, James wore polished shoes and sharp suits and spoke with a tone that made people listen. But when it came to his mother, he didn't listen much at all. He had called the night before. "Mom, we need to talk about moving you into somewhere safer," he'd said. "Safer?" Eleanor had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not young anymore, and this place is falling apart. There's a home across town. It's affordable. You'll have nurses and people to look after you." Eleanor had stared at the quiet phone long after he hung up. Her hands trembled as she put it back on the receiver. He hadn't asked how she was feeling. He hadn't asked what she wanted. Now, as she sat in the soft glow of the afternoon, Eleanor felt a hollow ache in her chest. She was not confused. She was not helpless. But James saw her only as an old woman who had lived too long and cost too much. To others James spoke kindly, saying things like, "She needs more care than I can give." But Eleanor heard the truth in his voice. She was a burden. She said little, but her eyes, a faded shade of blue, carried years of quiet pain. Once, those eyes had seen war. They had seen death and courage and hope. But now, all they saw was a world that had quietly forgotten her. The courtroom was cold and quiet, the kind of quiet that made people shift in their chairs and clear their throats for no reason. Mrs. Eleanor Ward sat at the end of a long wooden bench, her back straight and her hands resting on her lap. She wore her best gray coat, buttoned all the way up, and held a small worn box with a leather strap in her lap. No one noticed it but her. Her son James Ward stood across the room in a clean black suit, his tie neatly tied. He spoke to his lawyer in a low voice, nodding and glancing back at Eleanor now and then. He looked confident, like a man used to winning. The judge entered the room and took her seat. She was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and calm, steady eyes. Her nameplate read Judge M. Rivera. She looked around the room, then down at the papers in front of her. "Let's begin," she said. "Mr. Ward, you're asking for legal guardianship of your mother, correct?" James stood and straightened his tie. "Yes, Your Honor. My mother is no longer able to care for herself. She forgets things. Her apartment is unsafe and she refuses help. I'm only trying to do what's best for her." Eleanor said nothing. She didn't even look at her son. She stared at the box in her lap, rubbing her thumb across the top. The judge turned to her. "Mrs. Ward, do you understand why you're here?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Do you have anything you'd like to say at this time?" Eleanor looked up, her eyes calm but tired. She didn't speak. Instead she held the box a little tighter. Her court-appointed lawyer leaned in. "She has something she'd like to submit, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Eleanor opened the box with care. Inside were papers, photographs, and a small polished medal that glinted under the courtroom lights. She handed the box to her lawyer, who carried it to the judge. James gave a quiet sigh and folded his arms. "Your Honor, whatever that is, it's not important to this case." Judge Rivera didn't answer. She was already opening the box and lifting out the top document. Her eyes scanned the page, then she looked again, longer this time. The courtroom stayed silent. Judge Rivera carefully turned the yellowed paper in her hands. The edges were frayed, but the writing was still clear. It was an official document, old but proudly preserved. She read a few lines quietly to herself, then glanced at the small medal lying in the box, bronze, shaped like a star, attached to a faded red, white, and blue ribbon. James shifted in place and let out a sigh. "Your Honor, I'm sure that's just some old war memorabilia. My mother likes to hold on to the past." The judge didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the document. "This isn't just memorabilia, Mr. Ward, this is a military record, highly decorated, I might add." James blinked but said nothing. Eleanor sat still, her hands folded once again in her lap. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't proud or boastful, she simply waited. Judge Rivera turned another page and read more. It says here, Mrs. Eleanor Ward served as a field nurse during World War II, stationed in France, multiple commendations for bravery under fire, risked her life to treat wounded soldiers during enemy attacks. The room grew quieter. Someone in the back shifted slightly. The young clerk beside the judge paused her typing. The judge picked up a black and white photo from the box. It showed a younger Eleanor in uniform, kneeling beside a wounded soldier, wrapping a bandage around his arm. Dirt smudged her cheeks, and a helmet sat crooked on her head, but her eyes were the same, focused, calm, full of strength. James opened his mouth, then closed it. He had never seen that photo before. Judge Rivera looked at him now. "Did you know your mother was awarded the Bronze Star for heroism?" James gave a weak shrug. "She never talked about it." "She didn't need to talk," the judge said, setting the photo down. "The papers speak for her." Eleanor said nothing. She wasn't waiting for praise. She hadn't brought the box to impress anyone. She brought it because for once, she wanted to be seen as more than someone's burden. And now, slowly, the courtroom was starting to see. Judge Rivera cleared her throat, and gently placed the photo back in the box. She picked up the top paper again, the one with the military seal in the corner, and began to read it aloud. On July 14, 1944, Nurse Eleanor Ward, under enemy fire, crossed an open field to reach a downed medic and 2 injured soldiers. Despite heavy shelling and the threat of sniper fire, she provided care, stabilized the wounded, and stayed by their sides until help arrived. Her actions saved 3 lives. For this she was awarded the Bronze Star for bravery and devotion. A hush fell over the courtroom. The words hung in the air like the echo of a distant drum. No one moved. Even the security guard by the door stood straighter. Eleanor sat motionless, her eyes cast down. Her cheeks were pale, but her hands were steady. James shifted again, now uncomfortable in his polished shoes. "That was a long time ago," he muttered under his breath. "She was young. It's not really relevant anymore." The judge raised her eyes, sharp and clear. "Is that what you think? That courage and sacrifice fade with time?" James looked away. Judge Rivera continued. "There's more here, several more entries. It says Mrs. Ward served for 4 years, mostly on the front lines. She helped set up field hospitals, cared for the dying, and once stayed behind with wounded soldiers. When her unit was forced to retreat, she risked capture because she refused to leave them." Eleanor's lips trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. "She received 3 commendations," the judge said softly, "and she never asked for recognition. She returned home, raised a family, and carried all this in silence." A woman sitting near the back wiped her eyes. A young man leaned forward, as if hearing a story no one had ever told before. The judge looked again at Eleanor. "Mrs. Ward, I'm sorry no one has honored you properly until now." Eleanor raised her eyes and gave a small nod. It wasn't pride she felt, but something deeper, relief maybe. She had lived so many years feeling invisible. Now, her truth was out in the open, and it mattered. James tried again. "With all respect, Your Honor, she still needs help. She lives alone. She forgets things. That's why I came to the court." The judge paused, her voice firm now. "You came to court because you wanted control, Mr. Ward, but I'm beginning to think you've forgotten who your mother is." James said nothing. For once, he had no answer. And in that moment, it was no longer Eleanor who looked small, it was him. The silence in the courtroom felt different now, heavier, filled with something like shame, and something else, respect. Judge Rivera gently closed the folder of papers and folded her hands. "I have seen many guardianship cases," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "but very few come with a history like this." James stood still, but his confident posture had wilted. He opened his mouth, searching for the right words, but none came. There were no more business terms or excuses that could cover what had just been revealed. Eleanor didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the window, where a thin sliver of light peeked through the curtain. Her thoughts weren't in this courtroom. They were far away, with the men she had helped, the places she had stood, and the moments that had shaped her long ago. A soft sniffle came from the gallery, A young woman in the second row was wiping her eyes with a tissue. A man in a worn jacket gave Eleanor a slow, respectful nod. Strangers who hadn't known her name just minutes before now looked at her with quiet admiration. "She's not just my mother," James said finally, his voice low. She was a nurse, a good one, brave. "I didn't know all of this." "She didn't need you to know," Judge Rivera replied, "but she does need your respect." James lowered his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge turned to Eleanor again. "Mrs. Ward, you've been quiet through all of this. I want to be sure you understand everything that's happening here." Eleanor nodded once. "I do. Do you feel safe in your home?" "I do," she said again, her voice soft but clear. "I can still manage. I just needed someone to listen." And finally, someone had. For the first time since the hearing began, Eleanor sat a little straighter, her shoulders relaxed, her hands stopped trembling, and though she said no more, the room had already heard everything it needed. Judge Rivera sat quietly for a long moment, her hands resting on the folder filled with Eleanor's military papers. Then, with a deep breath, she leaned forward and spoke. "I've heard both sides, and I've reviewed the documents Mrs. Ward has provided. Based on what I've read, and what I've seen here today, I do not believe guardianship is necessary." James looked up quickly. "But Your Honor," the judge raised her hand. "Mr. Ward, your concerns may have started from a place of care, but your actions speak differently. You tried to take full control of your mother's life, without truly understanding her. That is not guardianship, that is dismissal." James lowered his eyes again, the words hitting him harder than he expected. "I am appointing a caseworker," Judge Rivera continued. "Someone neutral, who will visit Mrs. Ward's home, and help her with anything she may need. Paperwork, safety checks, resources. But you, Mr. Ward, will not be making decisions for her. Not today, not unless things change, and she cannot speak for herself." Eleanor blinked slowly, taking in the words. A soft breath left her lips. "Mrs. Ward," the judge added gently, "thank you for your service. What you did, what you gave, will not be forgotten. Not here, not anymore." Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. There was something shining in them now, not pride exactly, but peace, a quiet, long overdue kind of peace. She gave a small, respectful nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." The courtroom was still. Even James didn't move right away. As the judge rose to leave, she paused, looking one last time at the woman on the bench. "Sometimes," she said, "the strongest people are the quiet ones, and sometimes the world forgets, but not today." With that she stepped out, and the gavel never even had to fall. Eleanor slowly gathered her box, holding it close to her chest. The metal inside didn't shine much, but it didn't need to. Its story had finally been heard. James stood near the door, his shoulders heavy. He didn't know what to say. Maybe there was nothing he could say, and Eleanor didn't wait for him. She walked forward, one slow step at a time, but taller than she had in years. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter than it had going in. The light from the windows stretched across the floor, catching in the strands of Eleanor's silver hair. She walked carefully, one hand on the box, the other gripping the wooden railing for balance. People passed by, but now they looked at her differently. A man in a green jacket stopped, and said quietly, "Thank you for your service, ma'am." Eleanor gave a soft smile. "You're welcome." A young woman no older than 25, approached shyly. She wore blue scrubs, and had a hospital badge clipped to her shirt. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice trembling a little, "I'm a nurse too. I never knew stories like yours existed. You've inspired me." Eleanor touched the girl's hand gently. "Then keep going. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." The young woman nodded quickly, tears forming in her eyes, before she stepped away. James stood a few feet behind Eleanor, staring at the floor. His tie hung crooked now, and the confidence he had worn earlier was nowhere in sight. He looked like a boy again, unsure and small. "I didn't know, Mom," he finally said. "I should have asked. I should have listened." Eleanor didn't answer. She simply kept walking. Maybe forgiveness would come, maybe not, but she didn't need to carry his guilt. She had carried enough. Outside the building, the city moved on like always, cars rushing, people talking, horns beeping. But for Eleanor, the world felt new. The air seemed lighter, the sun a little warmer. She stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, holding her box to her chest. The metal inside wasn't just a memory now, it was proof. She was never just someone's burden. She had lived, she had served, she had mattered. And now, at last, the world remembered.